I'm Cliff Ribner, and I'm going to talk to you today about the Wagner Act and the New Deal. The Wagner Act was passed in 1935, legalizing unions, but it did much more than that. It didn't just make them legal. And by the way, they were completely illegal before that. They violated antitrust law, and every state has what's called tort law. It's part of the common law that we inherited from England. It's the law of free men. The common law is what free men want to protect us from our fellow citizens. It's the only law that does. It was developed by judges over centuries, basically institutionalizing as a legal matter the Ten Commandments. What's very important about it, it's very different from the type of law they have in Europe, which is basically regulatory agencies that dictate everything. It's not like that. What the common law is, it's laws which govern contracts, property. Tort law is part of it. That's what governs civil wrongs. But it always applies only after the fact. You don't have to ask anyone's permission to do something because you're a free person. That's why it's the law of free men. It punishes people and rewards people after the fact, after due process in court. It's the only law under which the government is allowed to give orders to citizens, and that requires due process. The English developed this, and the part of the law of torts, there are what's called business torts, one of which is tortious interference with contract. It's a tort to interfere with someone else's contract with someone else, and that's what unions do. Unions are inherently Marxist. The whole concept behind them is Marxist. It creates this dichotomy between workers and the employer, so that workers are different. The employer, even if it's just some guy who works his off every day, he's not a worker in the concept of Marx. He's an employer, but they don't call them employer. He's the bourgeoisie. That's an insult in Marx's terminology. And he exploits the employees. That's the whole concept behind this, that employees are forced to work for that particular employer, and that particular employer inevitably exploits him. So they need a union there to force the employer to disgorge the profits he gets, to the fair share of those profits to the employees, as if they were shareholders. But the whole concept behind it, first of all, under Marxist ideology, profit is considered evil, even though profit is what companies get, which keeps them in business. It's the reason for them to be in business, is to get profits. And it's the way they get profits. Marxism can be summarized very easily. All businessmen are thieves. That's what they believe. And all businessmen are simply trying to poison and exploit their employees and customers. They really believe this. And profit is evil. They actually believe that also. Profit, in reality, is what happens under the law of the marketplace when a willing buyer and a willing seller enter into a transaction willingly. The profit isn't extracted, it's not extorted, it's not extortion. Marxists view it as extortion. And that's not what it is. It's what both the buyer and the seller experience in connection with purchasing and selling whatever the seller is selling and whatever the buyer wants to buy. It's a voluntary transaction. Nobody is forcing anybody to do it. And if the seller isn't producing goods of value to the buyers, the seller goes out of business. So profit is what they both experience. And there's no compulsion for anybody to do anything. That's what's called market power. When someone has a product or a service that someone else values, and the value is equal to the amount of money the buyer wants to pay. Money is the measure of the value of that. And if the seller can do that and have money left over after paying all the expenses of producing it, he gets a profit. And if he can't do it for that, he goes out of business. So profit is what buyers end up providing, but it's all voluntary. And the buyer experiences profit also. And we know that because he wouldn't do the transaction if he didn't want to. Under Marxist analysis, there is no such thing as a free market. It's all compulsory. They actually believe that everybody only does things because of one type of power, the power of violence as threatened. They'd have no concept of the power of market power, which is a different type of power. And markets do have power. And there's always a market, no matter what. Even in communist countries, it's illegal, so it has to be a black market, which means only crooks can do it. It becomes dangerous. But people always want to buy things. They have to. We have to, just to stay alive. And in a communist country, it's not available. You go in the stores and the shelves are empty because they make the promise that they're going to give you everything for free. And what it is, there's nothing there for free because there never is. All the promises of communism are lies. Anyway, that is what is underlying the concept of why unions are good. Or that's why people thought unions were good. Actually, there was a brief time, basically from the turn of the century and up until maybe the 1940s, up until World War II, when there were fewer jobs than there were people. But one of the reasons there were fewer jobs in the 1930s, and part of that was a result of a huge immigrant influx, which had been happening since, really it started after the Civil War. There was a huge influx of people who, most of whom didn't speak English when they came here. A lot of whom were very smart. They came primarily from Eastern Europe, and there was a time when there arguably was a shortage of jobs. So what unions did, they made an argument that we have a reason to be here because the employer is going to exploit these people and make them work for too little under horrible circumstances. That is no longer the case now, and that hasn't been the case. And that's why, even though unions were both legalized, not only legalized, I'll talk about the Wagner Act in a minute. The Wagner Act was in 1935. It made them legal, and it practically made them compulsory. It made it very difficult in many businesses for you not to be forced to be a union member if you wanted to work there. The owners didn't want them because they're a mess. What they do is they interfere with the entire employer-employee relationship. So the whole nature of unions is that they inherently violate the common law tort of tortious interference with business. If they hadn't been made legalized and basically practically compulsory under the Wagner Act in 1935, they couldn't be in America. And employees and employers could simply negotiate between them. It poisoned the relationship between employees and employers, and also among fellow employees. Everyone is forced to be paid the same amount, whether they're doing a good job or a bad job. It's all one size fits all. That's the way collectivist stuff always is. And unions are collectivists. And the people that are in charge of unions always have been communists. Always, from the very beginning. Other than, there were some that were less so, like George Meany. He was an auto workers union person. Anyway, today, nobody wants to be in a union. Roughly 10% of the population are in unions. 10% of the people that are employed by other people. And by far, most of those union members are in what's called public employee unions. They're people who don't work for private employers, the public sector. It means they work for the government, and they're in government unions, and I've made videos about why those unions are they're absolutely unconstitutional, because they interfere with the entire operation of the government, because the union ends up paying certain politicians, they end up negotiating with themselves. There are no profits to split up, so the whole logic of unions doesn't apply. And FDR said this. FDR, who was the president when they passed the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act is very specific. It only permits private employer unions. Anyway, the Wagner Act came out in 1935. What it does is, the way a union is created is there is a vote. But once it's there, in the business, it's there. It's very difficult for the people who work in that business to get rid of the union. And they have to worry about getting beaten up by organized crime. Organized crime, basically, the Wagner Act happened at the same time as the end of the Depression. So organized criminals who had been making a fortune off of prohibition until it was abolished in 1932 or 1933, organized crime needed a new way to make money. And they used the unions. They were the army that unions would use to beat up people who didn't go along. And in some states, you're not even allowed to work for a place unless you're a member of the union. But the unions were legalized in the Wagner Act I want to tell you what Henry Morgenthau, who was FDR's Treasury Secretary, he was there throughout the whole New Deal. And the New Deal was one statute after another imposing all sorts of burdens on businesses, supposedly to benefit the little guy, and supposedly to end the terrible unemployment that was in the country. And of course, what they did was they made it impossible for employers to want employees. Things like unions. Employers don't want to have a union involved in their business. I'm going to read you the words of Henry Morgenthau. And he said, "We are spending more money than we have ever spent before, and it does not work." When he said it does not work, he's referring to the whole New Deal. And he said, "What we have come up with is a huge debt." And I'm now quoting him. "The whole New Deal has been a complete waste of money. It has not worked, and we are faced with a situation which is very serious." That's what he said in 1939 after the New Deal had been there throughout the 1930s. It prevented businesses from expanding. It crushed the economy. And the Wagner Act permitted unions. It was an intrinsic part of the New Deal. And by the way, all those statutes that created the New Deal, we still have. We haven't gotten rid of them. If we got rid of them, it would just be a huge burden taken off of businesses. Businesses have learned how to accommodate to them, but it's very expensive for the businesses. It reduces the amount of employment in the country. We would have even more or less unemployment than we do now, and there would be even more demand for employees. What it is in real life, as opposed to Marxist thinking, what employees want is to have an employer who has a need for them. And the more employers there are who need employees, the better it is for employees. So that things that create impediments for employers to hire employees are terrible. That's why unions are that's one of the reasons unions are terrible, besides the fact that they treat employees horribly. And by the way, when unions were first formed, what would happen is there was a real shortage of jobs. There was massive unemployment in 1935 during the New Deal. And it wasn't until World War II that the unemployment rate went down. And the reason for that was because for purposes of the war, FDR lifted all the constraints and let the free market build all the things we needed for war. So it wasn't creating products that the people of America could enjoy. In fact, people suffered from great privation during the war. It was a very tough thing for everybody here at home. But we created just incredible amounts of weapons. It was basically, he turned it over to a free market. We didn't have a Pentagon in those days. If we had a Pentagon, we would have lost World War II. The Pentagon imposes impediments to building or for the military to acquire things. It creates all kinds of stupid rules. They even have environmental rules. I mean, it's nuts. The whole thing is crazy. And the only thing that should be involved in selecting weaponry should be, is it going to work? That's the only thing that matters. Is it going to be lethal? And are we going to have the best army in the world so that nobody even thinks about going near us? That's what we want the military for. And that's what we use our nuclear weapons for every day. Unfortunately, Russia now has just as many as we do. It's crazy. At one time, they didn't have any as a practical matter. In fact, until 1957, they had no way to deliver actual nuclear weapons to hit us. They didn't have any missiles. The way they ended up getting them was by reverse engineering our missiles and stealing them. That's how they got their nuclear weapons. So they had a nuclear test in 1949, but they couldn't use them. We had thousands of them, and right through the Eisenhower, in fact, right through the Kennedy administration, we had overwhelming nuclear supremacy. We had 31,000 nuclear weapons by the time Lyndon Johnson left office, and we had basically stopped making them then. We had 25,000 when Kennedy was president. That's why the whole notion that there was a risk of World War III when the Russians put nuclear weapons into Cuba, it wasn't really. The Russians weren't that stupid. We would have wiped them out in a nuclear war. And Kennedy basically gave Khrushchev everything he wanted. But that's off the subject. I want to talk about the Wagner Act. We have to repeal this. I just read you the words of Henry Morgenthau. He was talking about all the New Deal legislation. All of that was just complete junk. And it put us in debt. It was tax and spend policies, but it was worse. It created these agencies. The Wagner Act created the NLRB, so that once a union is in a business, it's very hard for the employees to get rid of it. Today, even though about 10% of employees overall belong to unions, that represents, of the private sector, it's only about 6%. And in those cases, basically they're vestiges, they're leftovers. When they're unions that were adopted years ago, and it's just very hard to get rid of them once you have them. That's really why those unions even exist. Every time a union tries to force a vote on having a new union, the employees vote it down. That's what happened recently. And of course, the union, under the Wagner Act, it's all stacked in favor of the union, but they still can't get anyone to vote for it. Anyway, all of that New Deal legislation must be repealed. I just read you the words of Henry Morgenthau. He knew exactly what he was talking about. He was FDR's Treasury Secretary. And he was saying how the whole New Deal was a complete worthless thing. And the Wagner Act was part of that. The Securities Act of 1933 that created the SEC, all kinds of stuff. All those agencies, the first real big batch of those agencies after the batch that was created when Theodore Roosevelt was president. When Theodore Roosevelt was president, he created the FDA, which had absolute power over the entire agricultural business. There really wasn't much of a pharmaceutical business in those days, like nothing like today. But what it does is whenever the government gets involved in these agencies, it corrupts all of the participants in the free market because they have to go to the government to get approval for everything. They can't sell anything unless the government gives it an okay. It's terrible. It's European type law. It's the opposite of common law. It creates a prior restraint on anyone doing anything so that even though Americans are so ingenious, they get around these things, which is why we still have the biggest economy in the world. It's nothing compared to what it could be. And in fact, for the last 40 years, the only part of the economy that's actually been growing has been the things associated with the internet. And that's because that's the one part of the economy that the government can't stick its nose into. And the parts of it that it can, and they've tried, under Obama, they tried to stick the internet under the same regulatory regime that in the Interstate Commerce Commission would govern the railroad. It's the same. He tried to duplicate that same regime for the internet that Jimmy Carter presidency had determined was utterly worthless for the railroad business. And thank God President Trump got rid of that. But that's what these agencies do. I read you exactly what Henry Morgenthau said. And we have all of this worthless legislation that's still there. All these agencies are still there. The only people who benefit are lawyers, and it corrupts the entire business. Lawyers and lobbyists, that's it. And the reason we can't get rid of it, by the way, is because the Senate has made sure that's the case. That's what the filibuster rule works. It creates a ratchet so that it requires 60 votes to repeal anything. That's why nothing ever gets repealed. Even when we have a Republican president and Republican House and Senate, they still don't repeal anything. Even now, under President Trump, he has to do all this stuff by executive order because he can't get the Senate to change that. For reasons that I don't understand, he's not opposed. He hasn't said that he wants the filibuster rule eliminated. I've given many talks and shown in an article how the filibuster rule is completely unconstitutional. It was created under a section of Article 1, Section 5, which gives the Senate and the House also the power to make rules of their proceedings. It doesn't give them the power to change the Constitution. And that's what the filibuster rule does. It requires a supermajority as the general rule in the Senate instead of a simple majority. When you require a supermajority, then you can't get anything done without the minority going along with it. That's the nature of it. The founders understood that, and that's why they call having a majority requirement the Republican form of government. That's what they consider a Republican form of government. Majority rule among the elected officials, just as it's majority rule to get them elected. And we need to get all of that New Deal legislation repealed. I'm Cliff Ribner, and if you like what I have to say, like this video and watch my other videos at cliffordribner.com and YouTube, and read my book, Freedom's Last Stand. Thank you.